There's a genuinely strange kind of poetic justice buried inside this entire ongoing war. One that most people, following the bigger headlines about bunker busters and ballistic missiles, have almost certainly missed entirely. Because one of the most consequential new weapons the United States has used against Iran this entire year is, in almost every visible way, a direct copy of Iran's own signature drone. Same silhouette, right down to the wing shape. Same delta wing configuration. Same basic flight profile and cruising speed that has haunted air defense planners from Ukraine to the Red Sea for years now. Except this particular version was built in Arizona rather than Tehran. It costs a fraction of what most modern precision munitions typically cost the American taxpayer. And it has now become one of the most consistently active weapons in the entire American arsenal, being used against the very country whose original design it was directly copied from. It's called Lucas, and Iran genuinely did not see this specific move coming. Not because the underlying technology itself represents some kind of closely guarded secret breakthrough, but because almost nobody expected the United States to respond to Iran's cheap drone strategy quite this directly, by simply building its own nearly identical version and turning it right back around at the country that invented it. So let's actually walk through where this weapon originally came from, how fast it went from a quiet Pentagon courtyard demonstration to an actual combat weapon striking real targets deep inside Iranian territory, and why its continued, steadily expanding use throughout this entire war might represent one of the more significant and lasting shifts in how the American military actually fights going forward. And if you want to keep following every twist of this conflict as it develops, go ahead and subscribe. Because these are exactly the kinds of stories that tend to get buried underneath the bigger headlines. To understand why this weapon matters so much, you first have to understand the problem it was actually built to solve, and that problem has a name that will be painfully familiar to anyone who has followed the war in Ukraine over the past several years. Iran's Shahed 136 is a cheap, slow delta-wing loitering munition, essentially a flying bomb that costs a small fraction of what it takes to shoot one down. Iran has spent years mass-producing this exact weapon and handing the design off to allies and proxies across the region. And Russia adopted a domestically produced version of the same drone, marketed under a different name, to terrorize Ukrainian cities by the thousands. The entire strategic logic behind a weapon like this isn't about precision or raw destructive power. It's about economics. A single Shahed might cost somewhere in the range of $20,000 to build. The interceptor missile needed to shoot one down, whether that's a Patriot, an advanced surface-to-air missile, or a ship-based system, can cost anywhere from several $100,000 to well over $1 million per shot. Fire enough cheap drones at a well-defended target over time, and you inevitably force your adversary into an impossible math problem. Either spend a genuine fortune defending against weapons that cost almost nothing to produce in bulk, or let some meaningful percentage of them through and simply accept the resulting damage. That exact strategy is what has made the Shahed family of drones one of the single most consequential weapons of the past several years of global conflict, spanning multiple wars and multiple continents. And it's precisely the same strategy Iran brought directly into this specific war against the United States and Israel as well. It's worth spending a moment on exactly how the Shahed became such a dominant design in the first place, because that history explains why copying it made so much sense from an American strategic standpoint, rather than simply looking wasteful or unoriginal. The original version of this drone family first saw operational use back in 2019 during an attack on a major Saudi oil refinery, and from there it spread rapidly. First into the hands of Iran's regional proxies across the Middle East, and then into Russia's own war against Ukraine, where a domestically produced Russian variant of essentially the same airframe has been launched by the thousands against Ukrainian cities, critical infrastructure, and civilian targets over the past several years. Some analysts, tracing the design lineage even further back, note that the aerodynamic concept behind the Shahed itself draws on ideas that go back decades, connecting loosely to earlier Israeli target drone concepts and even older Cold War-era loitering munition designs from the 1970s and 80s. In other words, the exact silhouette that has now become one of the most recognizable and most feared weapons of the current era of drone warfare has a long, tangled lineage running through multiple countries and multiple conflicts, and the decision to build an American version of it wasn't really about copying Iran specifically, so much as it was about finally embracing a design philosophy, cheap, delta-wing, mass-producible loitering munitions, that had already proven itself devastatingly effective in the hands of multiple different militaries over several years of real combat use. So here's where the story gets genuinely interesting, because instead of simply trying to out-engineer that threat with even more expensive interceptors, American planners made a different decision entirely. They decided to fight economics with economics. Back in July of last year, an Arizona-based engineering firm called SpectreWorks showed off a system at a Pentagon courtyard event where the Defense Department was actively soliciting new equipment ideas from more than a dozen competing companies. What SpectreWorks brought to that event wasn't originally designed as an offensive weapon at all. It started life as something called the FLM-136, a target drone specifically built to simulate the exact flight profile, cruising speed, and radar signature of Iran's own Shahed 136, so that American air defense crews could actually train against something that looked and flew like the real threat instead of practicing against a generic target that behaved nothing like what they'd actually face in combat. In other words, the Pentagon had literally built a fake Shahed purely to help its own defenses get better at shooting down the real thing. And then, within about a month of that Pentagon demonstration, the Air Force put out a request for something new, an exact replica of the Iranian Shahed 136 itself. Not a training target this time, but an operational weapon. SpectreWorks took that same airframe, the one originally designed purely as a defensive training aid, and adapted it into a genuine one-way attack drone, weaponizing exactly the same silhouette that had spent years terrorizing Ukrainian cities and threatening commercial shipping across the Middle East. The resulting weapon, officially named the Low-Cost Unmanned Combat Attack System, or LUCAS for short, carries a maximum takeoff weight of around 180 pounds, noticeably lighter than the actual Iranian Shahed it's modeled after, with an operational range described by officials as extensive, reportedly reaching several hundred nautical miles, and a payload capacity of around 40 pounds, which analysts following the program have described as roughly twice the explosive yield of a Hellfire missile packed into a much cheaper, much more expendable airframe. It can be launched multiple different ways, from a catapult system using rocket-assisted takeoff, or from a mobile ground station, giving commanders enormous flexibility in how and where they actually deploy it. And the price tag is what makes this whole story genuinely remarkable from a strategic standpoint. Each individual LUCAS costs somewhere around $35,000, a figure that puts it in almost exactly the same cost bracket as the Iranian weapon it was built to counter and eventually replicate as an offensive tool of its own. What makes the timeline here so unusual and honestly so revealing about how urgently the Pentagon has been trying to change the way it buys weapons is just how fast this entire program moved from a courtyard demonstration to an actual combat weapon striking targets inside Iran. Traditional major defense acquisition programs, the kind that produce a new fighter jet or a next-generation missile system, can take the better part of a decade just to reach the earliest formal development milestones, let alone actual combat deployment. LUCAS went from its first public unveiling in July to full combat employment against Iranian targets by the end of February, a total of roughly 7 months from a demonstration table in a Pentagon courtyard to an actual weapon striking real targets in a real war. Defense officials have openly credited that speed to specific lessons drawn from watching drone warfare unfold in Ukraine over the previous several years, where both sides fielded thousands of cheap, expendable unmanned systems and demonstrated in real time that speed and volume can matter just as much as raw sophistication. Some individual unit commanders inside this program were even granted direct procurement authority for certain purchases, letting them bypass layers of bureaucratic approval that would normally slow this kind of acquisition down to a crawl, and the entire effort was organized under a Pentagon initiative, explicitly aimed at closing the gap between American and adversary production capacity for exactly this class of low-cost unmanned system. LUCAS made its actual combat debut on February 28th, right as the broader war against Iran opened with what officials described as a decapitation strike, an enormous coordinated assault targeting Iran's supreme leader, senior military commanders, and hundreds of military sites across the entire country within the first 24 hours alone. Central Command's newly formed Task Force Scorpion Strike, an entire unit built from the ground up specifically to operate this new class of one-way attack drone, launched what officials described only as a significant number of LUCAS drones as part of that opening wave, paired directly alongside Tomahawk cruise missiles and a much larger conventional strike package. The commander of Central Command put out a public statement describing the moment in fairly striking terms, noting that for the first time in history, the task force had launched what he called countless one-way attack drones as part of an operation. And a separate Central Command statement went even further, describing the moment with a level of dry irony that clearly wasn't lost on the people who built this weapon in the first place, noting that these low-cost drones, modeled directly after Iran's own Shahed design, were now delivering what the statement bluntly called American-made retribution. And Iran answered almost immediately, in a way that made the entire irony of this specific weapon even more pointed. Within the same window of fighting, Iran launched a wave of its own actual Shahed drones at the headquarters of the United States Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. A handful of them got through the base's defenses, causing what officials described as minimal damage and no casualties, with the facility remaining fully operational throughout. So think about what actually happened in that opening exchange. Two air forces, on the very same night, both leaning on functionally the same weapon design, the the same cheap, mass-producible loitering munition architecture that Iran itself had pioneered and proliferated across multiple conflicts over the preceding several years, each one firing that weapon at the other's most valuable regional infrastructure. That is about as direct a piece of battlefield symmetry as modern warfare has produced in a very long time. And it tells you something important about how thoroughly the economics of cheap drone warfare have reshaped military thinking on both sides of this specific conflict. It's also worth noting that Iran wasn't even the first place this specific weapon saw real-world use, which adds another layer to just how quietly this program had already been proven out before it ever made headlines over Iranian airspace. Reports have indicated that Lucas drones were also used earlier this year during the American mission into Venezuela's capital, connected to the effort to capture that country's president, meaning that by the time this weapon made its far more publicized combat debut against Iran, it had already been quietly tested in a genuine operational environment under real conditions, rather than purely in a training or demonstration setting. That earlier, largely unpublicized use matters because it means the confidence commanders showed in leaning on this weapon so heavily during the opening hours of the Iran campaign wasn't blind faith in a brand new, completely unproven system. It was a calculated decision built on at least one prior operational deployment that had already validated the basic concept under real-world pressure. What's made Lucas particularly interesting to defense analysts isn't just that opening combat debut, though. It's how quickly and how broadly its actual employment has expanded since that first night. The Navy had already demonstrated a first-at-sea launch of a Lucas drone from the flight deck of an Independence-class littoral combat ship operating in the Arabian Gulf, even before the war formally began, validating the concept of launching these drones directly from surface warships rather than relying purely on fixed ground positions or mobile land-based launchers. That capability matters enormously in a theater like the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz because it lets American commanders reposition strike capacity constantly without needing to build out additional land-based infrastructure anywhere in the region, while also letting drones originate from genuinely unpredictable directions and locations that complicate Iranian defensive planning in ways a fixed, predictable land-based launch site simply cannot. An adversary trying to defend against an attack that could theoretically come from a ship anywhere across an enormous stretch of open water faces a fundamentally harder targeting and early warning problem than one facing drones launched from a small number of known, fixed-ground facilities. There's a genuinely clever piece of engineering underneath all of this that goes beyond the drone's airframe itself, because Lucas doesn't operate as a purely isolated weapon flying blind toward a single fixed coordinate. It integrates into what the military calls a multi-domain unmanned systems communications mesh network, letting the drone function simultaneously as both a strike asset and a communications relay node, even in the kind of GPS-denied or heavily jammed electronic environment that Iran has repeatedly tried to create across contested areas of the Gulf throughout this entire conflict. That dual functionality matters enormously in a theater where electronic warfare and jamming have become such a central feature of the broader fight. A weapon that can still coordinate with other assets and maintain some level of connectivity, even when an adversary is actively trying to scramble GPS signals and disrupt normal communications, gives commanders a meaningfully more resilient tool than a purely standalone drone flying a single pre-programmed route, with no ability to adapt or relay information if conditions on the ground change mid-flight. It's worth pausing here to really sit with what this specific weapon represents strategically, beyond just its individual combat debut, because the underlying logic behind it is arguably more significant than the weapon itself. For years, the dominant assumption inside Western military planning was that technological sophistication and cost were always going to be dramatically asymmetric in the West's favor, expensive precision munitions against comparatively primitive adversary weapons. What conflicts in Ukraine and across the Middle East have repeatedly demonstrated over the past several years is that this assumption completely breaks down once an adversary starts fielding large numbers of genuinely cheap, mass-producible drones, specifically designed to saturate and exhaust expensive defensive systems. You cannot sustainably spend $1 million defending against a $20,000 drone forever, no matter how much wealthier your country is than your adversaries, because the math simply doesn't scale in your favor over an extended campaign involving hundreds or thousands of individual engagements. Lucas represents the American military explicitly acknowledging that reality and choosing to compete directly within it, rather than continuing to rely purely on far more expensive precision weapons for every single target that comes up, including plenty of targets that genuinely don't require anything close to that level of sophistication or cost to actually neutralize. And that cost logic plays out in a genuinely important secondary way too, one that goes beyond simply being cheaper to build in the first place. Every time a Lucas drone gets launched at a target, whether it's an air defense node, a radar installation, a command facility, or a missile launch site, It forces the defending side to make an immediate decision about how to respond, and that decision itself carries real strategic value, regardless of whether the drone actually destroys anything. If Iranian air defense crews choose to expend a genuine interceptor missile shooting down what is, from a radar signature standpoint, virtually indistinguishable from their own Shahed design, they're burning through limited and expensive interceptor stockpiles, defending against a weapon that cost the United States next to nothing to build and launch. If they choose not to intercept it and simply accept whatever damage results, that's a real, if smaller scale strike accomplished against Iranian infrastructure at minimal cost and minimal risk to any American personnel. Either outcome favors the side using the cheap, expendable weapon, and that dynamic is exactly why officials involved in the program have specifically described Lucas as being suited for saturating or probing enemy air defenses, striking lower priority targets that would never justify spending a multi-million-dollar cruise missile, and generally forcing an adversary to spend down finite defensive resources across a much larger number of individual engagements than they would otherwise need to manage. This same broader philosophy extended into the naval domain as well, through a related unmanned system called the Global Autonomous Reconnaissance Craft, or GARC, an unmanned surface vessel that has been quietly logging hundreds of hours and thousands of nautical miles on patrol duty in direct support of American operations against Iran. These uncrewed boats have played a genuinely important role in the broader effort to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz for commercial shipping traffic, extending persistent surveillance and patrol coverage across the exact waters where Iran has spent years threatening tankers with mines, fast attack boats, and coastal missile batteries, all without putting a single additional American sailor at direct physical risk in one of the most contested and dangerous stretches of water on the entire planet. Central Command has been notably tight-lipped about exactly how many of these systems are in operation, or precisely how they're being employed tactically. But the confirmed patrol numbers alone, hundreds of hours and well over 2,000 nautical miles logged in direct support of operations against Iran, tell you this isn't an experimental side project running quietly in the background. It's become a genuinely integrated part of how the broader campaign to secure that critical waterway has actually been conducted month after month. It's also worth situating Lucas within the much broader wave of new weaponry that this entire war has ended up showcasing, because it wasn't the only genuinely novel system making its combat debut during this conflict. And seeing it alongside everything else happening in the skies and waters around Iran helps put its specific significance into proper context. During roughly the same stretch of fighting, the Army's new precision strike missile saw its own first combat use, a long-range, ground-launched system capable of striking targets hundreds of kilometers away from mobile launchers, giving commanders a deep strike option that didn't require tying up scarce air power for every single distant target. Directed energy weapons, laser systems designed specifically to shoot down incoming drones and rockets for a fraction of the cost of a traditional interceptor missile, were used successfully in this same conflict as well, tackling exactly the same underlying cost asymmetry problem that Lucas addresses from the opposite direction, defending cheaply against cheap threats rather than attacking cheaply with cheap weapons of your own. Even manned fighter aircraft achieved genuine firsts during this war, with fifth-generation jets recording history's first confirmed shoot-down of an enemy aircraft by that specific airframe. Seeing all of these genuinely novel systems debut within the same relatively compressed window of fighting tells you this conflict has functioned as something close to a live-fire showcase for an entire generation of next-wave military technology all at once, not just for Lucas in isolation, but for an entire family of systems built around the same underlying premise that speed, cost efficiency, and rapid fielding now matter every bit as much as raw sophistication. Stepping back from the specific hardware for a moment, what this entire episode really represents is a meaningful philosophical shift inside how the American defense establishment thinks about buying and fielding weapons in the first place, and that shift didn't happen by accident. Defense officials have been explicit that watching years of drone warfare unfold in Ukraine, where both Russia and Ukraine fielded thousands of low-cost unmanned systems and demonstrated that sheer production volume and rapid iteration could matter just as much as individual weapon sophistication, directly shaped how urgently the Pentagon pursued something like Lucas, once the prospect of a real war with Iran started looking increasingly likely. That urgency produced genuinely unusual acquisition behavior for an institution normally associated with painfully slow, multi-year procurement cycles. Streamlined approval processes, direct procurement authority handed down to individual unit commanders for certain purchases, and a public willingness to field a weapon derived from a training target rather than waiting years for a purpose-built system to work its way through the traditional defense acquisition pipeline from scratch. It's also worth understanding just how competitive the broader landscape has become around exactly this category of weapon, because SpectreWorks is hardly operating in a vacuum here. The company is competing directly against a wave of much larger, better-funded rivals for this exact category of Pentagon contract, including established players like AeroVironment and newer, Silicon Valley-backed defense startups like Anduril and Shield AI, all of them racing to establish themselves as the primary supplier for the next generation of low-cost, mass-producible unmanned systems that the American military increasingly believes it will need in enormous quantities for any future large-scale conflict. That competitive pressure has, if anything, accelerated the entire pace of development and fielding across the whole sector, because no single company wants to be the one still working through a multi-year prototype phase while a competitor's weapon is already seeing real combat use and generating the kind of operational data and battlefield credibility that tends to translate directly into future contract awards. There's also a genuinely important nuance here worth being honest about, because it would be easy to overstate just how transformative a single weapon system like this actually is on its own, in isolation from everything else happening throughout this war. Lucas has not replaced precision munitions, and nobody involved in this program has ever claimed it was designed to. It complements far more expensive systems like Tomahawk cruise missiles, precision-guided bombs, and the various bunker-busting weapons that have done the heavy lifting against Iran's most hardened and most strategically significant targets throughout this entire conflict. What Lucas actually does is fill a specific, previously underserved tier of the target list, the enormous number of lower priority sites, secondary infrastructure, and defensive nodes that genuinely don't justify the cost or the risk profile of a much more expensive weapon, but that still need to be struck, or at least threatened regularly enough to keep pressure on Iran's broader defensive posture. Understanding that distinction matters, because it explains why this specific weapon, despite being genuinely revolutionary in terms of acquisition speed and underlying strategic philosophy, was never going to be the single decisive weapon of this entire war on its own. It was always meant to be one deliberately cheap, deliberately expendable piece of a much larger, layered strike architecture. And it's worth thinking through how genuinely disorienting this must have been from Iran's own perspective as this war unfolded. Iran spent years developing the Shahed, specifically because it offered a way to threaten far wealthier, far more technologically advanced adversaries without needing to match their level of investment dollar for dollar, banking on the assumption that a cheap, expendable weapon fired in large numbers would always hold a structural advantage over expensive defensive systems built to counter it. Watching the United States respond not by simply building more expensive interceptors, but by fielding its own version of that exact same cheap weapon and using it offensively, effectively removes the one strategic advantage Iran's entire drone doctrine was originally built around. If your adversary can build essentially the same weapon you invented at a similar cost and deploy it back at you just as easily as you deploy it at them, the asymmetry that made this class of weapon so attractive in the first place largely disappears. That's a genuinely uncomfortable position for Iranian military planners to find themselves in, and it likely explains part of why officials describe the psychological framing around this specific weapon's combat debut in such pointed, almost deliberately provocative terms, deliberately emphasizing that Iran's own design was now being used to deliver what one official statement bluntly called American-made retribution right back at the country that built it. So what does the continued and expanding use of this specific weapon throughout this war actually tell us about where American military strategy is heading more broadly, well beyond just this one conflict against Iran? It suggests a genuine and probably lasting shift toward treating mass-producible, relatively low sophistication unmanned systems as a core pillar of how the United States plans to fight future wars, rather than treating them as a niche or experimental capability sitting alongside the traditional arsenal of exquisite, extremely expensive precision weapons. Every additional sortie Lucas flies against Iran generates real combat data on reliability, on how effectively Iranian air defenses actually respond to it, on production bottlenecks, and on exactly how this weapon performs when it's being used at real operational scale rather than in a controlled training environment. All of that data will almost certainly shape how aggressively the Pentagon invests in this entire category of weapon for whatever conflict comes next, whether that's a future confrontation somewhere else in the Middle East, a contingency involving a completely different adversary, or simply the ongoing effort to make sure American forces are never again caught without a cheap, scalable answer to the kind of low-cost drone saturation tactics that have already reshaped modern warfare in Ukraine and across multiple theaters over the past several years. There's also a broader industrial dimension worth thinking through here, because the entire premise behind a weapon like Lucas depends on the ability to actually manufacture it at scale, quickly and cheaply, whenever a real operational need arises. That's a fundamentally different industrial challenge than building a small number of extremely sophisticated, extremely expensive aircraft or missiles, and it requires defense contractors to think much more like consumer electronics manufacturers, optimizing for volume and cost efficiency than like traditional prime contractors, building small batches of exquisite hardware over many years. Whether American industry can actually sustain that kind of production tempo over a longer, more extended conflict, one that might require thousands rather than hundreds of these systems, remains a genuinely open question, and it's one that officials overseeing this broader acquisition strategy have flagged directly, citing the production capacity that adversaries like Russia and China have already demonstrated they can bring to bear on exactly this category of weapon, as the benchmark the United States now feels real pressure to match. So where does this leave things looking forward, both for this specific conflict and for the broader trajectory of how modern militaries are choosing to fight? Within this war against Iran specifically, expect Lucas and systems like it to keep playing an expanding role for as long as active operations continue, precisely because the cost logic behind them only gets more favorable the longer a sustained campaign drags on, and the more targets accumulate on the broader list that never quite justify spending a far more expensive weapon. Beyond this specific conflict, the real story here is less about any single drone, and more about what its rapid development and combat deployment reveals, about how urgently American defense planners have concluded they need to fundamentally rethink the balance between exquisite, expensive weapons and cheap, expendable ones, a lesson drawn directly from watching exactly this kind of asymmetric drone warfare reshape multiple conflicts across the world over the past several years, and one that this specific war against Iran has now tested and validated under genuine high-intensity combat conditions, rather than just in a training exercise or a controlled demonstration. What do you think this specific shift actually means for how future conflicts get fought? A genuinely smart, overdue correction to how the Pentagon buys weapons? Or a risky bet on cheap mass production that might not hold up the same way against a more sophisticated adversary than Iran has ultimately proven to be? Let me know your honest takedown in the comments below, because this exact debate, sophistication versus scale, is genuinely dividing serious defense analysts right now, and there isn't an obvious consensus answer even among people who study this professionally. And if this breakdown helped you understand a piece of this war that usually gets completely overshadowed by the much bigger headlines about bunker busters, ballistic missiles, and dramatic explosion footage, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with someone who's been following this conflict closely and genuinely wants to understand what's actually happening underneath the surface. And make sure you're subscribed so you catch the next update the moment this campaign shifts again, because with a weapon this cheap and this easy to keep producing, it almost certainly will. Thanks so much for watching this entire breakdown all the way through to the very end, and we will see you again in the very next one.